Mr. Vernon, we accept the fact that we had to sacrifice a whole Saturday in detention for whatever it was we did wrong. But we think you're crazy to make us write an essay telling you who we think we are. And you see us as you want to see us. In the simplest terms, with the most convenient definitions. But what we found out is that each one of us is a brain, and an athlete,
And a basket case. A princess.
and a criminal. Does that answer your question? Sincerely yours, The Breakfast Club.
Don't you.
On August 6, 2009, John Hughes, the fiercely private filmmaker who captured the hearts and neuroses of an entire generation of disaffected teens in the 1980s, stepped out for a morning walk near his hotel in Manhattan. He and his wife were visiting their son James and their new grandson, and had just finished breakfast when Hughes decided to step out for some fresh air. Although still months away from turning 60, those close to Hughes knew the famed writer-director hadn't been in perfect health. He had gained weight over the years, struggled with hypertension, and was a longtime smoker, habits known to have profound long-term health consequences. He had also been living a far more sedentary lifestyle in recent years after retreating from the spotlight. Friends say he occasionally mentioned feeling tired and even sometimes complained of chest discomfort, but like many men of his generation, he was not one to dwell on personal ailments or seek frequent medical attention. Having long since retreated to a quiet life on a farm in Lake Forest, Illinois, he stopped directing movies after the disappointing reviews and commercial performance of 1991's Curly Sue. It appeared the reclusive nature that had defined much of his post-Hollywood life was mirrored by his approach to his health: quiet, private, and perhaps dangerous. But if the new millennium saw Hughes retreat from the spotlight, it did little to dim the reality that he was once at the very center of it. For nearly a decade, from the early 80s through the early 90s, Hughes had built one of the most influential bodies of work in modern American film. With movies like 16 Candles, The Breakfast Club, Pretty in Pink, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and Some Kind of Wonderful, Hughes redefined adolescence on screen, offering raw vulnerability, biting humor, and emotional depth that stood in stark contrast to the slapstick or sanitized teen movies of the past. He made stars out of a young cast of actors known as the Brat Pack, and gave audiences a new, emotionally honest lens on what it felt like to be young, confused, and searching for identity. But his impact extended beyond scripts. Hughes mentored countless writers and directors who grew up on his films, shaping the sensibilities of everyone from Judd Apatow to Kevin Smith. His fingerprints are all over modern teen and family comedies, with films like Home Alone and National Lampoon's Vacation, both written by Hughes, becoming cultural institutions in their own right. He was a generational voice who never chased awards or accolades, but whose work resonated deeply with millions. Still, Hughes' epic run as the undisputed king of teen comedies wasn't entirely without controversy. He was criticized, especially in later years, for the lack of diversity in his films, and for certain character tropes that have not aged well. His treatment of female characters, often through a lens of idealization or objectification, has drawn scrutiny in the decades since the 1980s. Even Molly Ringwald, his longtime muse, has acknowledged that while his films were formative and full of heart, they also contain moments that some audiences today might view as troubling. Hughes was also known to be stubborn in the creative process, often clashing with studios and even with collaborators who challenged his vision. But what remains as undeniable today as that summer afternoon in 2009 when he stepped out for a walk after breakfast with his family is this: John Hughes didn't just make teen movies, he gave voice to the interior lives of teenagers in a way no one else had, or perhaps ever will. His films weren't just about prom, detention, or skipping school. They were about anxiety, longing, alienation, and the fragile process of becoming who you are. And in some sense, he knew exactly who he was and where he stood in Hollywood history when he stepped out that day for a walk. Just minutes later, Hughes collapsed after suffering a massive heart attack on a quiet sidewalk on West 55th Street. He was rushed to nearby Roosevelt Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. John Hughes was just 59 years old. I'm Derek Kaufman.
I'm Jason Beckerman.
And this is Last Days, John Hughes.
News of John Hughes' death came as a complete shock, not just to family, friends, and collaborators, but to his legions of fans. Although many of his classic movies served as emotional milestones of adolescence for people who had long outgrown those formative years, the passing of a voice of a generation predictably led to long bouts of adult reflection from his most ardent admirers. The suddenness of Hughes's passing only added to the public's sense of loss. Though he had receded from the public eye in the mid-1990s, Hughes remained a towering figure in American popular culture. Initial tributes poured in from former collaborators, fans, and critics, all of whom underscored his unique ability to capture the internal lives of teenagers with empathy, wit, and unflinching honesty. Molly Ringwald, the star of 16 Candles, The Breakfast Club, and Pretty in Pink, said she was, quote, stunned and incredibly sad, and called him, quote, a wonderful writer and director who has a huge influence on my life. Matthew Broderick, who starred in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, remembered Hughes as a genuine, kind, and creative genius. Indeed, the Brat Pack, the group of young actors immortalized in Hughes's films who owed their meteoric rise in the public consciousness largely to him, responded with a mix of grief and reverence. Anthony Michael Hall, Hughes's frequent on-screen alter ego in the early 1980s, called him like a big brother and said Hughes, quote, believed in me in a way that changed my life. Ali Sheedy, who played Allison in The Breakfast Club, spoke about Hughes's unique ability to, quote, listen to young people and write about them without condescension. Judd Nelson and Emilio Estevez, both of whom had worked with Hughes at the height of his teen movie success, released statements praising his vision and the impact he had had on their careers.
Jason, we've been circling John Hughes indirectly for a little while when we did John Candy's episode. He played such a critical role in so many people's careers, nobody more than the Brat Pack. I mean, you know, John Candy didn't comment here because John Candy had already passed, but he would have certainly commented on John Hughes' death as well. They were very, very close friends. It had a profound impact on John Hughes when John Candy passed. For you, you're right in the center of this. When the John Hughes wave came about, you were a teenager. You were mostly, Molly Ringwald's age at the time. So when you saw movies like The Breakfast Club or 16 Candles or Pretty in Pink, how did it feel different than other movies at the time?
Let me just start by saying something, sort of an umbrella concept for me. He is the most important pop culture figure in my life.
Wow.
And I felt that at the time. These movies were all... I don't know if they were my favorite movies at the time, but they were the most important movies because they were the cultural currency with which I dealt. Every group of teenagers in whatever era they're in have them. It might be Taylor Swift or I don't know, the Marvel movies, you know, now. For me at this time, these were the movies that were the touchstones. These were every summer you would look forward to. You heard Pretty in Pink was coming out. You knew Molly Ringwald was in another movie. Even Home Alone, which is the end of my sort of adolescence, was one of the most important movies. I mean, if you talk about the most sort of iconic movies in American history, Home Alone is there. It's not one of the greatest movies, but iconic, it certainly is. If you go back through that list that you mentioned of his movies, they're incredibly important to the American filmography, and they're incredibly important to me because, to your point, I was a high schooler. This was the vernacular with which we spoke. The lines that would come out of these movies was the shorthand with which my generation spoke.
It's a great point. And, you know, you were a teenager. I was a little bit younger than you, but so movies like Home Alone and Uncle Buck, which had these younger characters in them, really spoke to me. What John Hughes did more than any other writer, director from that time period, or really that I've seen since, maybe Judd Apatow tapped into this a little bit. He was sort of the voice of a subsequent generation. But John Hughes, those little kids sounded like how I thought. Yeah. That was what Macaulay Culkin really captured. Was he was devilish, he was mischievous. That was how kids of that era saw themselves, and John Hughes captured it better than anybody.
The Breakfast, I don't want to prattle on too much here, but The Breakfast Club, I think, is the classic example. I didn't particularly identify with any of those characters, but all of them.
You were goody two-shoes. You weren't in detention.
But even there were goody two-shoes. Yeah, no, but there were goody two-shoes in that group, but they all spoke to a different sort of, part of the growing up experience. You could relate to all of them, and it was brilliantly written. My wife is from Chicago, and she went to the high school where a lot of those films were shot, and you can imagine how important they were to her and her friends. I mean, look, I don't want to overstate it, but that's who this guy is. There's maybe 10 filmmakers in American movie history, I think, that can equal him, and we can name them all, on our fingers without thinking too much about it. He's on that list.
He's right up there. Hughes' funeral was a private affair, held in Lake Forest shortly after his body was returned from New York. The service was attended by close friends, family, and a few collaborators. True to the persona he had adopted in his final years, though, Hughes' funeral reflected his quiet life outside of Hollywood. There was no media presence, no red carpet of celebrities, just a farewell to a man who had once been at the center of pop culture, but had chosen to live out his later years far from its glow. And in the years following his death, several tributes to Hughes emerged, both official and grassroots. The 82nd Academy Awards, held in March of 2010, featured a special tribute segment led by Molly Ringwald and Matthew Broderick, which honored Hughes' contributions to film.
As an actor, I just listened to John and I did whatever he told me. And thanks to him, for the last 25 years, nearly every day, someone comes up to me, taps me on the shoulder, and says, "Hey, Ferris, is this your day off?" To me, John was a friend and a mentor, a private man, a family man, and in his own quiet way, one of the funniest human beings I've ever met.
A montage of his most iconic moments played for the tearful audience, including clips from Weird Science, Home Alone, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And later that year, Ringwald published an essay in the New York Times reflecting on her complex relationship with Hughes and the lasting influence of his films.
At the time of his death, Hughes was still writing, often under pseudonyms like Edmond Dantes, but he had no major public projects in active development. He had quietly contributed to family comedies such as Beethoven, Flubber, and Made in Manhattan, often without taking credit. His personal journals, discovered after his passing, were filled with unproduced story ideas, fragments of dialogue, and reflections on filmmaking and fatherhood. Some of this material was eventually referenced in the 2012 documentary, Don't You Forget About Me, which explored Hughes' mysterious withdrawal from the film industry and included interviews with many of his former collaborators.
More than a decade after his death, John Hughes' legacy continues to loom large. Filmmakers from Greta Gerwig to Judd Apatow have cited him as a primary influence in their work. His movies remain essentially timeless touchstones for carefree youth and teenage angst, still regularly screened in high schools and college dorms and continuing to elicit laughs and tears from new generations. Despite occasional critiques of dated tropes or lack of diversity in his films, his body of work remains an emotionally rich portrait of adolescence, one filled with longing, rebellion, awkwardness, and resilience. And for millions, John Hughes didn't just make movies, he made memories. John Hughes' film legacy began not on a studio lot, but in the advertising world of Chicago, where he first cut his teeth as a copywriter. His ability to write punchy, relatable dialogue led to gigs writing jokes for stand-up comedians, and then eventually for National Lampoon, where he honed a voice that was both irreverent and deeply observant. His breakout screenplay, National Lampoon's Vacation in 1983, captured a dysfunctional family road trip with warmth and absurdity, and it was a surprise hit that signaled Hughes was capable of much more than just sketches.
We just drove 2,460 miles just for a little Roy Wally entertainment. The moose says you're closed, I say you're open.
We're not really violent people. This is our first gun.
No, it isn't.
This was what set Hughes apart from other bawdy and raunchy comedies of the era. His stories were both comedic and heartfelt, and I always point to that's what a truly successful, lasting film. There are movies from this era, like Porky's, that don't last. Porky's was incredible. When I was a kid,
hilarious.
you know, some of the scenes were cited by people, you know, sticking the penis through the shower hole and so forth. But they don't last like a movie like Vacation because you don't care about the characters.
Yeah.
They're just doing hijinks and it's one-upsmanship and no heart. When you watch Vacation, you like the family. You love the Griswolds. I still play Holiday Road in my car on every road trip with my family because I like that movie.
The most important scene, I think, in Ferris Bueller's Day Off is after the full day of antics, right? They come home and Cameron, the car has all the miles on it. Cameron's got to deal with his father. He's tearful. He's then got to deal with his father. You have the soliloquy of Ferris Bueller where he talks about wanting to marry Sloane and what's going to happen when they break up. That's what gave that movie body. It's funny. It's hilarious. You could have gotten by, to your point, it becomes it's elevated. The jokes are funnier than I think Porky's is, but
it's not just dancing in Chicago.
That's what the movie would have been. But he tied it all up with those incredible moments of emotion at the end, towards the end, where you grow to love these characters. You grow to feel for them and want for them a life beyond what was on screen. And that's what made it great.
And some people think the 80s gets too sentimental. I think Hughes was on the better end of that.
Yeah.
Like his movies, there is certainly a sentimental quality to Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, to Uncle Buck, to Ferris Bueller's, but they're so funny and they're so sort of wonderful to watch that you forgive the little bit of cheesiness in the lines.
Apatow pulls this off pretty well,
Absolutely.
right? Knocked Up is a great example where it's hilarity and slapstick and the whole thing. everything. But then you get to the end, and there's a real meaningful moment between Katherine Heigl and Seth Rogen.
Yeah.
And you begin to love these characters and see that what's going to happen in their future. They probably divorce 6 months later, but
Sure.
at least you grow to have an affinity for them that I think in Porky's, you didn't care about any of the characters.
That's exactly right.
By the mid-1980s, Hughes had shifted his focus to a demographic often ignored or caricatured in mainstream media, teenagers. His directorial debut, 16 Candles, in 1984, was a seismic moment in teen cinema. For the first time, adolescence was portrayed with emotional nuance and biting wit, not filtered through adult eyes, but presented from the inside out. Hughes gave teenagers voices, desires, flaws, and agency. He wasn't afraid to make them awkward, self-absorbed, and misunderstood, and audiences responded to that honesty. With The Breakfast Club in 1985, Hughes stripped away the usual high school stereotypes to reveal the vulnerability behind each label, crafting a story that transcended genre and became a universal coming-of-age touchstone.
You're not fooling anybody, Bender. The next screw that falls out is gonna be you.
Eat my shorts.
What was that?
Eat my shorts.
You just bought yourself another Saturday, mister.
Crushed.
You just bought one more right there.
Well, I'm free the Saturday after that. Beyond that, I'm gonna have to check my calendar.
Good!
The scene is emblematic of Hughes' skillful writing, nimbly juxtaposing the middle-aged principal desperately clinging to a small turf of authority during Saturday detention against the rebellious and vaguely nihilistic attitude of a troubled teenager.
We have to pause on The Breakfast Club. I think it is his signature movie. I think when John Hughes is remembered, the first thing that comes to people's minds is probably The Breakfast Club.
It might be Home Alone because box office-wise, it's so enormous, but to me, it's his best movie, 16 Candles, Breakfast Club.
And it really holds up because even though he is sort of presenting the characters as stereotypes, he calls them the jock, the prissy one, the nerd, the athlete, and the rebel. They're all so deep in that movie, and it's just filmed in one room for the most part. And I really love that film because the nerd character I always identified with, and that was who John Hughes saw as kind of his avatar. That was Anthony Michael Hall. He tells that story of having his butt cheeks taped together and his dad putting so much pressure on him. And it was not just the geek you saw in 80s movies with the glasses and the tape on them. He was a real person, and Molly Ringwald had a friendship with him. And by the end of the movie, Judd Nelson is also friendly to him. They were like
the whole
humans.
thing is that these five characters are totally different upbringings and walked into this detention center on a Saturday morning, totally isolated from one another. Realize that all of their problems are the same. They suffer from teen problems that are common despite who you are. And that's the emotion that makes him different than other filmmakers.
It's really powerful stuff. And it's impossible to sufficiently examine Hughes' legacy without looking at it through the prism of some of the teen stars he actually created and the careers he impacted with his iconic films. Of course, there's Molly Ringwald, who became Hughes' muse and the face of 1980s teen angst, saw her career skyrocket thanks to their collaborations. Hughes reportedly wrote 16 Candles with her in mind after seeing her headshot, and her performance as the lovesick Samantha Baker captured something ineffable about being a teenage girl in America. And their work together in Pretty in Pink and The Breakfast Club solidified Ringwald as an icon of the era. And although their creative relationship eventually frayed, she would forever remain linked to Hughes' unique cinematic voice. And for many young actors, being cast in a John Hughes movie wasn't just a job, it was a rite of passage.
I want to talk about Ringwald for a second because she's gone back and forth. She's always honored him as a filmmaker and acknowledged what he did for her career. But she was also very critical of her portrayal and the portrayal of other young women in the movies that she did. She was very critical of him. There was a particular scene in The Breakfast Club when Judd Nelson's character is hiding from the guy who's running detention.
Yes,
and he goes underneath her desk and then
looks up her dress.
You see a shot, and the shot is directly up between her legs, up to her underwear.
Scandalous.
And she really felt that it was unnecessary for the scene. It was completely sort of objectifying her in a way that wasn't necessary. And she said she suffered from some trauma from having to go through that. And she kind of objected in her own way as a young girl to John Hughes. You don't really object, but she did, and she got nowhere with it. And I think
I've heard that, and she's certainly entitled to her feelings about the way those movies were filmed at the time. For one, I thought it was true to the character. I mean, this is John Bender was the rebel, and he was.
I think it's the shot between her legs. You didn't need to show the shot directly up.
You could have just shown him looking.
Very young girl. I think she was of age, but the shot is very intimate. You see right up to her underwear, and her legs are spread. So it's not in any way sort of like wink and a nod. It is you're seeing what you're seeing. And I think that was the argument. Like, you could have just showed them from the side.
Or his reaction.
Or even whatever. I mean, there could have been different ways to do it. And she really felt that it was kind of, her needs as a young woman and an actress were completely tossed aside for the bit. Yeah. And it wasn't necessary.
And that's fair as far as it goes. These are her feelings. She had to sort of deal with the way that felt to her. I'm just saying, as a matter of that was part of what John Hughes was doing, was tapping into the perversity of young boys. He did it in 16 Candles when he held up the underwear. Like, that was panty chasing of the 1980s. But you're right. Maybe he didn't have to show the shot.
Forward. I mean, Home Alone doesn't have any of that stuff. Maybe he's dealing with a younger kid, so you couldn't really. I think the later movies maybe move forward with the times, but I think to the point you're making, but in the mid 80s, this was common fodder.
This was Porky's, man.
Right? Yeah.
But it wasn't just teen stars. He also played a pivotal role in the career of John Candy, which I mentioned, who was a fellow Chicagoan and Second City alum. Candy's performances in movies like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, The Great Outdoors, and Uncle Buck revealed a deeply empathetic comedic talent. Less a chubby object of derision played for cheap laughs than a deeply wounded soul who could bring laughs and tears in equal measure. Hughes wrote characters for Candy that let him be hilarious but also vulnerable. Lonely salesman, flawed father, lovable messes. In doing so, he gave Candy some of the richest roles of his career, elevating him from an ensemble comic to a leading man.
You want to hurt me? Go right ahead if it makes you feel any better. I'm an easy target. Yeah, you're right. I talk too much. I also listen too much. I could be a cold-hearted cynic like you. But I don't like to hurt people's feelings. Well, you think what you want about me. I'm not changing. I like me. My wife likes me. My customers like me. Because I'm the real article. What you see is what you get.
Their creative bond was rooted in mutual trust, and Hughes' scripts, most notably this tender speech in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, gave Candy the space to show pathos beneath the punchlines.
Hughes' teen films of the 80s were revolutionary in how they validated adolescent emotion. But he also helped redefine the family comedy in the late 80s and early 90s. Films like Home Alone, which he wrote and produced, Beethoven, and Curly Sue showed his ability to mix slapstick humor with genuine heart, often tapping into themes of alienation, protection, and childhood resilience. These movies became staples in households and holiday rotations, further embedding Hughes into the emotional lives of multiple generations. His screenwriting was deceptively simple, snappy, funny, and accessible. But beneath it was a sophistication in character and tone that influenced an entire generation of filmmakers. Judd Apatow, Kevin Smith, Cameron Crowe, and even Wes Anderson have all cited Hughes as a key influence. His movies taught them that stories about misfits, outcasts, and weirdos could be central, and that comedy doesn't have to come at the expense of sincerity. Freaks and Geeks, Lady Bird, and Juno all owe a debt to the Hughes formula of character-first storytelling with emotional undercurrents that sneak up on you.
John Hughes didn't just redefine a genre. He created a language for adolescence that still echoes today. From a quiet office in suburban Chicago, he built a cinematic world that turned teenage turmoil into poetry. He didn't just write about prom and peer pressure. He wrote about class divides in movies like Pretty in Pink, grief in Some Kind of Wonderful, and finding one's identity in movies like The Breakfast Club. He took characters who were often footnotes in other films, the jock, the nerd, the weirdo, and made them into fully realized protagonists. His movies told kids they mattered, that their feelings were real, and that their awkward, complicated lives were worthy of screen time. And so I thought it only fitting to give the final word to John Hughes himself, heard here talking about 16 Candles and how he authentically channeled teen voices to become the voice of a generation that wasn't even his own.
I wanted to make a very realistic movie about what it's like to be 16, what it's truly like to be 16, and to compress a lot of those things that you feel and that you experience when you're 16 into one day. And it became, it was never really a comedy, it was never really a drama. It had a little comedy and a little drama. Life is not always funny, life is not always tragic. And to portray it realistically, it's got to have a mix of both.